The Liberal Party of Canada votes on some new policies. I'm Marco Perry. Welcome to the Perry Platform. It's party convention season right now in Canada. You have all the major parties gathering together with their constituents and bringing up some new ideas and motions that will be voted on, and if successfully passed, will become official party doctrine. The Liberal Party was the most recent one to get the spotlight, and I will say, right before we even get into what they talked about, they had a far less controversial meeting than the NDP or the Conservative Party. The NDP had a bunch of nonsense in their priority list, like defunding and abolishing the military. The Conservative Party, on the other hand, were not even on the same page about recognizing climate change. Forget what to do about it, even to recognize that it's real. They couldn't do that. So the bar was set pretty low, and the Liberal Party just hopped over it with ease. As it currently stands, I really do think that Justin Trudeau and the Liberal Party are sitting really pretty. They're in a good position. So without further ado, let's get to what the party talked about. The first notion that they decided to vote on was implementing a universal basic income, and that was voted to a success. 491 delegates said yes, 85 reportedly said no. Now, reports also say that Trudeau himself wasn't very interested in the idea, but because the majority voted on it, UBI is now set to become an official party policy of the Liberal Party. And given the fact that the Liberal Party is in good standing, it's possible we see the beginnings of a UBI program begin to manifest in the not so distant future. Of course, there are some caveats here. It wouldn't be the first time that a party decided to make something their official policy and then backtracked on it later. Trudeau and the Liberals did the same thing with electoral reform. It was a major campaign point, and then they won, and they conveniently forgot about it. Could UBI go that same route? It's possible, but I do think this is so popular that it would be a massive detriment for them to ignore it after making it part of their policy. The cost there would be quite great. Something like electoral reform, it truly resonated mostly with people who were in the loop about politics, but UBI, essentially free money, that's going to resonate with everyone, and everyone's going to want it. Now, my opinion, is this good or bad? I will err on the side of saying it's good. I'm a fan of UBI, but the devils are in the details though. It matters how you implement it, and there's a philosophical lesson to be had here. Just because an idea is good, does not mean that in reality, when it's implemented, that it will turn out good. You can look at Marxism for a very clear example of that. What does the philosophy say? Well, it's concerned with equality. It wants to make people equal. It doesn't like the disparities that we see in things like the standard of living among citizens. Now, what happens in real life though? The idea, okay, it sounds good, it's charitable, but when implemented, sure you get equality, everyone's equally poor now. There's no disparity, everyone is in destitution. Is that good? No, it wasn't. So there's a connection there. You can also take something like increasing charitable donations. That becomes a policy for a party. Okay, it sounds good at the surface level, but let's say they go about doing that by forcing every Canadian to give up 50% of their take-home income. Well, it's not so good anymore. So good ideas don't necessarily have to lead to good ends. It matters how you introduce them and implement them. The same goes for UBI. It could be an amazing thing. The foundation is strong, but it could also be horrible too. UBI has the potential to elevate pretty much all Canadians out of poverty. But at the same time, it has the potential to throw the entire country into poverty. It's a double-edged sword. Now, why do I say that? One major factor to consider is how do we pay for it? It's massively expensive, and to not have a proper plan with that in mind, you can bankrupt Canada. Our debt could spiral way out of control, and we end up mortgaging the future generations of this country to satisfy an immediate need for some capital inflow. That could be crippling. And further, there's also the potential that it becomes a political tool, where politicians don't really care about what's feasible, what is sustainable, given our income and our balance sheet, but instead they just want to win the election, and what better way to do that than promising more money to people? you can easily see a sort of bidding war be possible, where one party says we'll make UBI 1200 and the other says we'll make it 13, and it goes back and forth, increasing exponentially. It's a cheap tool that's very effective to win support from the masses. For that very reason, I don't think UBI should be in the realm of politics. It should be an independent body like the Bank of Canada who sees to it if it becomes official and a real program here in Canada. That has to be baked in. And these are only two considerations there. UBI takes an entire framework to administer. Who is going to get it? How can we fund it? What are we going to do with the upcoming AI revolution, where more and more people will be dependent on a UBI to survive? It won't simply be a supplemental income in the near future. It will be your sole source, maybe. Can it deliver on that? So as you can see, there are many questions that have to be parsed out. It's not simply enough to vote yes, we want it, no, we don't. We have to talk about why do you want it? How are you going to make it successful? What are the reasons against it? What could go wrong? It has to be a holistic picture. Now, right now, it's just a vote on adding it to your policy list. So of course, it's the early discussion phase, but I do want to see more studies, more experts, more debate, and not just one-sided, where, Andrew Yang comes to mind. It's all positive. It's all good. No, we need both sides of it. We need the contrarian view too, to make sure we're covered. UBI is powerful in both ways. It can drag people up and it can drag you down. So the best way to make sure we don't end up dragging ourselves down is to prepare. So I do agree. Yes, make it your policy, but I do want to see more research on that. So the next policy that the Liberal Party voted on and passed was national standards for long-term care homes, and presumably that was spurred by the disparity we've seen in outcomes when it comes to these long-term care homes. They were decimated. There were many ethical violations that were occurring. For example, people being locked into their room forcibly. You can't go out anymore because the organization is trying to contain the spread. And various other issues were coming up. Questions about hygiene, questions about whether or not profit has become the primary motivation versus the patient's care. Stuff like that. And that's the problem when you do include a massive profit incentive into the healthcare system. They're contrary. You can think of something like let's say that a scientist who works for a major corporation comes up with a pill that can cure any type of cancer. And it's a cheap substance. Let's say he finds out that the common dust bunny under everyone's desk somehow has a magical property that can cure any type of cancer. There is no incentive truly for the company to go forward with that, because there isn't truly a profit motivation to incentivize them. It's a dirt cheap product and everyone has access to it. They would prefer if they found a miracle drug that was hard to get and cost a lot of money, and they could mark it up. They would line their pockets, and the side effect of that would be curing the disease, when in reality, if you think about it logically and morally, the proper chain of events there would be to cure the disease, and the secondary effect, if any, would be to line your pockets, and not to an obscene degree. Of course, if you develop something groundbreaking that can save so many lives, sure, you should be rewarded for that. But if we're thinking more so about the reward instead of saving the lives, we have our priorities backwards, and I don't think that capitalism does a great job when it comes to healthcare, especially when left alone. Capitalism is great. Many positive outcomes come from it, but it's not perfect. And here is one area where it needs some sort of government oversight. You need a regulatory body to say, hey, you can't do that, because your own self-interest isn't going to produce the best outcome for society. Now, that's contrary to what a libertarian might think, but there's no doubt that you do need some form of government policy to best align the capital market mechanisms with what society needs and wants. So here, there's no issue with it. I'm happy to see the government lay down some law, lay down some rules as to how a long-term care facility should be operating to live up to a high standard. We've seen too much variance here, and lives are lost because of it. So another policy that was passed by the Liberal Party was to transition to net zero carbon emissions by 2050. Now, Some people might hear that figure and think, well, 2050 is some time away. Do we really think that 2050 is an appropriate timeline? What kind of damage will occur due to that wait? And I will say, whenever a government gives a timeline like that, they're underestimating their own abilities on purpose. Why? Because they want to see a headline in the future, such as Canada meets zero carbon emission goal early. 10 years early, 5 years early, whatever, but early. It's a common saying to under-promise and then over-deliver. It's a safe bet, and it actually sets you up to impress the public. People will say, wow, you actually did something here. You're ahead of timeline? When does that ever happen in the governmental world? It's a wow type of headline. Now, the opposite though, let's say you think that you'll reach your goal by 2040, and there's little room for error there. You think it's possible, you think you can do it, but you're not 100% sure. If you don't give yourself that cushion of they're doing here, let's say, an extra 10 years, well, you put yourself in a precarious situation. Because if you fail to meet the timeline that you've laid out, let's say it was 2040 that they said, well, you're going to be destroyed by the public. They're going to see that, and they're going to say, you can't even stick to your promise. What are you doing? Are you incompetent? Whatever. You'll be hit with tremendous negative backlash. And it'll probably be the death of your political career, especially if it's an important topic like climate change. So, why make that risky bet? Give yourself some extra cushion. Give yourself that time so if something does go wrong, you can make up for it. If you think you'll be ready by 2040, say we'll be ready by 2045 and then over-deliver on the under-promise. And we see that too with things like vaccinations. Trudeau under-promised. At the beginning, he was saying something like in September, we might have every adult get their first vaccine shot. The timeline has accelerated. We're looking more so now by late summer. And maybe even sooner than that, because as America wraps up their vaccination efforts, there'll be more supply for us. And then you can have all the headlines saying that Trudeau is a magician, he was able to beat his own expectations, he's done yeoman's work, all that good stuff. But take the contrary example now. Let's say he thought that the best case scenario was we'd get them by early summer or whatever. If he said that and did not meet the timeline, he'd be destroyed. In fact, that might be enough to get him out of politics. People would be so angry about that. So, as you can see, there is tremendous utility to under-promising. And that's kind of the name of the game here. So yeah, they're saying net zero by 2050. I don't think it'll be 2050. I think it could be earlier than that. So there is some silver lining there if you were worried about it being too late of a target. But there is a question there as to the number itself. Is 2050, is 2040 appropriate? For that, you'd have to rely on the science, and it's not clear entirely by what year you have to be at net zero to save the planet, basically. It's up in the air still, and there's varying figures here. It is good, though, that we've set a target, that we have a goal, that we have something to move towards. There's no doubt that it's a good idea to get yourself to net zero. You don't want to do it abruptly, though, and sabotage your country. You have to have a gradual switch to transition the workers in these oil and traditional gas industries into renewables, to set up the infrastructure, to prepare your economy, and that takes time. So it's good that the goal is in 2023, and it's good that there is a goal in the first place, but maybe there is some room for fine-tuning it. But I do think it's a good thing to have a target. Now, another policy motion that was passed in relation to their previous one was they're going to be introducing tax incentives for large corporations to invest in renewable resource development. So, what's that mean? There are certain costs and time and infrastructure investments that are needed to even go about making your company renewable. Take solar energy, for example. You can't just decide to do that tomorrow. It's going to take time to install the panels. It's going to take time to work out the numbers to see how that works out, if it makes sense for you to even do it in the first place, and all of that. And that's where the question really is. Companies fundamentally look at the bottom line. If it costs them more money than not to become renewable, there's going to be hesitancy there. If the traditional gas and electrical and coal, whatever they're using, is cheaper, and better for their bottom line right now, they're going to opt for that. But if the government comes in and says, well, we're going to offer you a tax incentive to go about becoming renewable, that can change the equation. Because now it could even be cheaper for them to go renewable than to stay in their old ways, and that's a massive incentive. If you want to motivate a company to get with the times, that's how you do it. You use market mechanisms, and it's almost the same idea as a carbon tax. If you want to motivate people and companies to move away from gas and fossil fuels and whatnot, do it via the markets. Now, of course, the carbon tax is almost the reverse. It's a price imposed upon you by partaking in these disastrous activity from the environmental standpoint. But a tax incentive is the opposite. It's a reward for doing the opposite. It's a reward for thinking in a sustainable lens. There might even be situations where you can double dip benefits. If you get to cut back on your carbon tax spending because you're using less fossil fuels and whatnot, and you also get a tax incentive or a tax credit, whatever it ends up being, for investing in these renewable resources that are going to help you reduce your carbon tax bill, well, it's a positive feedback loop. And the savings there could be astronomical. So it is a good idea. It's not simply grandstanding. It's not simply a government saying, we're going to go net zero, but they're not giving any incentive for companies to get with the times. The government can do what they do, but the government isn't the entirety of the country. There are people whose behaviors have to change. There are companies whose behaviors also have to change. And there has to be a way to incentivize that. And it is a good thing that the government has explored it via market mechanisms like the carbon tax and tax incentives and whatnot. I do think market forces are very powerful. And if this comes to fruition, it could kickstart many large companies and their quest to become sustainable. If it helps their bottom line and it helps the environment, well, you're killing two birds with one stone. Now, there are many motions that were passed and some that were rejected, and I can't go over them all, but here are some quick ones that I will mention. These were tossed around. They weren't taken with the utmost seriousness, they weren't fast-tracked, but they are ideas that are being debated within the Liberal Party. The first one is investments in affordable housing, and that's crucial. Housing in Canada is a disaster. It's a mess, and it's not just in places like Toronto and Vancouver anymore. All of the reports are saying that markets across Canada as a whole have exploded. Even in places where you wouldn't consider to be real estate hotspots, they're growing tremendously. Why? Well, a lot of that money that was meant for places like Toronto and Vancouver are spreading outwards now because some people are just being priced out. So they have to look other places. Now those other places are growing too. And people who can't afford there are going to find other places, and it's a chain. Now there are many issues with the Canadian real estate industry. There are things like terrible zoning bylaws and whatnot. There are issues with foreign investment and empty properties. Lots of things going on. There has to be a plan to address that. One of the things that you could do is invest in affordable housing. Another thing you could do is look at these zoning bylaws. Another thing you could do is look at foreign ownership. Another thing you could do is, there's no end to it. There has to be a holistic policy here to improve the situation. It has gotten out of hand, and it's not wise for a country to have so much of the economy tied to real estate, because real estate in some sense can be seen as a cyclical market. And when a downturn does occur, it could be disastrous for the Canadian economy. We're talking about something that can trigger a recession. So, something to think about. To get that market under control and to find ways to bring that investment to other places, to develop other industry in Canada, not to be so tied to a select few. Now, another thing that was talked about was a Trans-Canada high-speed rail line. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought the Via Rail was that. I haven't ridden it before, I don't know too much about it, but when I first read this policy line, it came to my mind, what's the Via Rail doing? Is that not a Trans-Canada high-speed rail? Maybe it's not high-speed, maybe it's not Trans-Canada in the ways you want it to be, but if we can find a way to encourage Trans-Canada travel, I think that'd be cool. To bolster local economies by making it easy for people in Ontario to move to other provinces, from Manitoba to go there, Alberta to go here, it'll be good. It will be another one of those positive feedback loops. Instead of the Canadians traveling outside of Canada, maybe to America, to outflow their capital. We can keep it within the country, just transferring between provinces, and that's a net good for everyone. And the final thing that did catch my eye was a notion to expand access to high-speed internet across Canada. So if you don't live in a hub, in a large city, chances are your internet could be suspect at best. It could not connect when you want it to connect. The speeds could be very slow. There could be lots of blackouts and whatnot. And in 2020 or 2021 now, it's not a recipe for success, and it actually makes a lot of these rural communities unattractive to live in. Because now you can do things like work from home very easily. But how can you work from home in a rural community if your internet is shot? And things like e-learning, how can you do that if the internet is sketchy? If you can't work from home and have your kid in school at the same time because the internet would just crash. Something like high-speed internet is fast becoming an essential part of living in this current time. And to have it vary so much between locations in Canada, geographies, it's not good. And that actually ties in to the affordable housing issue. If you can make living in rural parts of Canada more attractive, you could alleviate some of the pressures on the hot real estate areas. Why? Because people can see the cheaper housing in maybe northern parts of the country, and if the infrastructure, like the internet, is good, maybe they can move there and enjoy that cheaper cost of living without having to sacrifice things like not having a proper internet connection. And of course, there are other issues with moving up to underpopulated parts of Canada. There aren't, all the amenities that you might be used to and whatnot. But if we want to fix that issue, something like internet is a foundational pillar to going about that. Now, if you want to see the full list of proposals and what passed and what didn't, I invite you to look up and find that list online. There's a lot of interesting points there, and like I said, it was the least disastrous party convention of the pot. You had the NDP, which was used to shooting themselves in the foot, and the Conservative Party, which follows suit. The Liberal Party stuck to seemingly more centrist ideas. They did not get too radical, and that was a good thing. They played their cards well, and they put themselves in a good position. So with that, it now brings us to the end of our conversation for today. If you enjoyed the content, be sure to leave a review and share. That will help us grow. And you can find me online at perryplatform.org and on social media at perryplatform. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you soon.